Welcome to Exploring Digital with Purr, a podcast for entrepreneurs and CEOs who want their businesses to benefit from a digital-first approach.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Exploring Digital with Purr. I'm joined today by John King, who is the head of digital at Stowe Family Law. Hi, John.
Hello, how are you?
Really well, and yourself?
I'm all right, can't complain.
Excellent. So do you want to kick us off by telling us a little bit about you, your background, and how you managed to find a role as head of digital at Stowe Family Law, and what it's like being head of digital at a professional services firm?
Yeah, certainly. So for my sins, I've been in law firm marketing pretty much for most of my life. It started off at the sharp end, so personal injury, very much stack it high, sell it cheap, that sort of thing. So I suppose I spent a lot of time in, volume operations. And so there's always a drive for efficiency and just trying to make sure that, margins are as great as they can be.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as marketing platforms have evolved and different sort of avenues and opportunities have presented themselves, there's just been a greater need to almost acquaint yourself with the newest technologies, the newest capabilities as soon as they come out, just to make sure you've got that edge and you've learned a lot before the competitors twig. So that was always quite interesting. And what you get is sort of like a natural, I suppose a natural synergy between tech and marketing in that regard, because very often to drive performance from marketing channels, you're often having to integrate customer data in new ways. You're having to plug different systems into each other. Very often, if you're using very archaic sort of legal CRMs, trying to get that to work would be a bit of a challenge as well. And very often, nearly all of the conversations and meeting you have sort of involve IT and tech to a certain degree, and very, very quickly new business and tech start to overlap. I wouldn't say they become one thing at all, but certainly there's room for someone to coordinate all of that to make sure that things work as they should and you get all the insight that you can. And so I've very much been helping Stowe along on that journey. It's been really exciting so far.
Brilliant. I mean, what proportion of law firms at sort of Stowe's scale would you say have that kind of function? I mean, do you think the adoption of that kind of role and those technologies is pretty widespread now, or is there a sort of substantial part of the market that's behind?
It's a difficult one. It depends which lens you look at it through. If you take the big nationals that we compete against, like Slater and Gordon, Co-op Legal Services, for example, they certainly will. I couldn't tell you exactly what the job title looks like, but certainly they're very, very much engaged in making sure the marketing gets everything that they need from a tech perspective so they can compete alongside everybody else. I think the challenge tends to be for much smaller firms. We'll come on to this later, but Stowe is a specialist in family law and family law only. So when you compare us to, say, Irwin Mitchell, for example, which are full service and they do everything, there's a bit of a scale problem there. Whereas if you've got the specialty family law practices operating at a local level, they're not as big as we are, and they can't get the same sorts of, I say economies of scale, it sounds a bit cliche, doesn't it? But the same sorts of returns that we see from tech as other people might. So I think it depends on the space that you occupy. Certainly at the higher end, absolutely. At the lower end, I haven't seen quite the same level of digital adoption as perhaps we've seen.
Yeah,
our competitors. So.
I think that's fair, and you're right to say that there's an economy of scale. At the same time, I think perhaps what's great about digital is it tends to be a relatively low-cost investment. If you look at the tools that are actually available and the licensees and the licensing model for these things, and the relatively low investment it takes to actually have some effect. All right, fine, you might not be making the full advantage of these things. So it could be that there's a big proportion of the market, maybe the more regional, the smaller firms, or those without this specialism that are missing out on. So it's a really kind of interesting area, I guess, for professional services firms to develop. And a good point I think you made earlier was that it's the more kind of transactional law practices, things like personal injury, as you said, probably things like will writing services, and the very kind of straightforward ones that have been the bits of the sector that have been able to innovate the fastest because it's the cleanest, simplest product to sell, and with a very clear message. And providing generalized law services, is harder, probably easier at a consumer level, but at the hardest level B2B. And I guess you guys have got a nice part of the market in that you're, I'm guessing with family law, you're exclusively selling that to consumers, which is an easier sell. But there's still things that B2B audiences could be learning, I'm guessing, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were quite right what you were saying before about, I guess, the simplicity of the service that you're selling. So with, I guess, things like visas, immigration and wills and things like that, very often the problem is quite, I'd say, finite. You know what you're going to deliver, and it rarely goes above and beyond that. So you can quite comfortably give things a fixed fee and everything else.
Yeah.
And so when you've got that very structured set of parameters, it's easier to do things in volume and use tech to facilitate a lot of that. Like you say, some of the challenge comes when things are a bit more, I suppose, when the goalposts are more likely to move. So in the case of family law, for example, whilst you might talk to somebody from the outset, you think, you know what, this is going to be quite cut and dry. Halfway through, you might suddenly find some information comes to light and you go, oh, crikey, this is going to be months, if not years of work now, And so it's much, much harder to stick that into compartmentalized boxes. And so again, when it comes to tech, I suppose what we're trying to do is to make it as easy as it possibly can be for the client, but also for the lawyers internally, because there's so many places to spin,
Yeah. And I guess where your role comes in, and it's an interesting question for professional services firms, is where's the disconnect? Where's the handover between what information can be gathered and what leads can be generated through what you do, and at what point does it get transferred to a fee earner to turn into some money, and how much can you automate before you get to them? But look, we'll come on to that. We've skipped our icebreaker section, so let's try our Jungian back and forth. And so I'll say a phrase, and you respond as best you can in one word, and we'll see what comes out. So please, if you will, can you describe to me with one word, Stowe?
Innovative.
John King.
Waffle.
Your team.
Fantastic.
And your work.
Exciting.
If you had to choose between time or money.
Time.
City or countryside.
Countryside.
Realism or dreams.
Dreams.
Night out or at home? You don't get much choice at the moment.
At home, fortunately.
Good, excellent. Right, thank you for the icebreaker section. So let's come back to the the conversation about Stowe and why you guys are different. I mean, the focus of this series of podcasts we're putting together is innovation, and innovation is something we talk to a lot of startups and tech companies and agencies about. And innovation, I guess, it's not a dirty word in professional services circles, and certainly it's progressing a little more. And you do see, I guess, employees and staff members at professional services organisations being encouraged to think a little more entrepreneurially and being and not being forced to think inside the box as perhaps they were, even a decade ago. So, what's particularly different about Stowe, and why do you think Stowe's been so successful in its growth and its adoption of technology?
I think there are a lot of different factors at play, and I think it's best to start with our focus, I suppose. More than anything, we want growth. We're not shy about that, and a lot of that comes from our ability to be commercial, to serve as many clients as possible, but also to deliver a really good quality service. And when you're trying to scale quality service, that's quite a tough ask. So more than anything, what we're trying to do is to give lawyers the ability to serve clients in the best way that they possibly can, and make sure that we're not putting anything in the way that could, I suppose, de-incentivize them from doing so. And this comes back a little bit to, I guess, putting things in boxes. And I know historically from other firms that I've worked with, very often you're KPI based on, your billable units and everything else. And so your focus is get as much work done as you possibly can that's billable for the client, and almost keep everything else to a minimum because it's just a distraction. Now, of course, when it comes to asking for reviews and making sure that the clients get everything that they need, and thinking of just new ideas to better serve them, or at the very least just answering questions that come up time and time again, very often in many firms that gets pushed to one side because it's not billable, And so given that the lawyers are the guys on the ground, the guys and girls on the ground, and they're the ones that are talking to the clients all the time, it makes the most sense to give them that flexibility to raise new initiatives, to basically talk to people and say, you know what, that's a really good idea. We should do something with that. And so once we enable that flow of feedback, certainly in marketing and on the IT side, we can do a lot more to facilitate it. So be it setting up new features on the site, making sure that everything's usable, making sure that we're keeping the friction to a minimum, minimum, I suppose, from that first point of call all the way through to first meeting with a lawyer. But there are loads of different things at play. So, I mean, I suppose if we look at how firms are traditionally managed, things like keeping people, I guess, tie their hands behind their back with the billable hour, that in of itself is quite a challenge. Looking at the kinds of systems that people use, even that could be quite challenging. Certainly during the pandemic, we had to almost uproot everything and make sure everyone could work remotely. And many firms weren't set up to do that because they were happy with what they had before. So it's all there's lots of different things there to consider, I think. The one thing that we've done very well at Stowe is giving people that flexibility, but also making sure we're measuring it as well. So whilst we obviously keep tabs on things like billable units and everything else, we are also looking at, how often do people ask for referrals and reviews? How often do people come to us with new initiatives? How often do they get involved in all the other things that we propose? Because, we've got a series of seminar talks on at the moment. How many lawyers put themselves forward to say, you know what, I want to be a part of that. I want to help the clients wherever I possibly can. And so it means that for those people that are very, very good at doing the work, of course, they will continue to excel. But for those that, like you say, like to think outside the box, like to get involved in new initiatives, and for those that have a good idea of where client service is going, they also have the opportunity to showcase that and also do something with it. And very often, a lot of the work that I facilitate, there's nothing to do with ideas from my team at all. It's just us bringing to life the ideas that have come to us through other lawyers in the firm.
So you're saying that really it's not about having a head of digital that leads the way. It's about empowering the people who are doing the work, the fee earners, to say, think a little differently. We will back you. We will facilitate those dialogues. And if you need a different system or an evolution of a tool, we'll make that happen.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay, so
it's a massive part of it.
So what would you say have been some of the, are there some good examples of things people have asked for, or some applications or things you've done to the site that have worked really well for you?
Yeah, so a really easy one is just answering questions that people ask.
Yep.
And we take it for granted, but we use call tracking software that records all the calls that we get and everything else. And if you listen to those, you hear the same themes and the same questions coming up time and again. It's all very well answering those on the phone, but very often somebody's called because they couldn't find the answer either on your site or on the internet at large. So you can do yourself a big favor just by asking a lawyer with a specialty in the subject, say, oh, by the way, we're getting this question asked quite a lot by the clients. Can you do us a write-up, or would you mind covering this in a webinar?
Yeah.
And then it's not just that you obviously rank for it as far as getting organic traffic and stuff is concerned. That then delivers more inquiries. But it also means that if you can do that through a webinar format, or you can get people to appreciate you as a human being, they're more likely to come to you because they know that you have the expertise. They know that you can solve the problem, and also you've made it accessible to them. So again, just making sure that technology facilitates all of that, I think, is the best way forward. So.
Oh, now that is a big mind shift. A shift in way of thinking, because if you think law has just been an industry where it is almost the definition of exchanging time for money, right? An industry that bills in 6-minute increments is pretty unusual in this day and age. And to be able to change that way of thinking and say, well, look, we're not going to encourage the client to call us so that they can rack up a higher bill and we can charge them 18 minutes for that little piece of information. We want to make their lives easier and our lives easier, because we're not answering mundane questions. We can do more of what we're better at doing, and provide that value-added service.
Absolutely, yeah. And it just means then that when people speak to us for the first time and they have that initial consultation with the lawyer, they can cover the things that are really important, the things that are really unique to them that can't be answered on the whole for everybody else. So rather than focusing on, I guess, more of the, I wouldn't say generic questions, but the ones that are easily answered, you can home in on the stuff that really, really helps people during that time,
Perfect. So, and do you think that's something that would apply to not just a consumer audience? Do you think that would work in a B2B world equally well, or is it? I'm guessing it's probably particularly well suited to the kind of things that you guys do. But there's no there are ways of expanding its remit.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've worked for B2B firms in the past, and it's the same thing there. You listen in the conversations, you get involved in the sales process, and again, you find the same thoughts, the same considerations, I guess the same worries and anxieties as well, coming up time and time again. And sometimes, the scenario does change, but the underlying feeling is there, and just understanding how you can I suppose, leverage your expertise and your knowledge of your subject area to make sure that that is okay and make it something that they can feel less worried about, and making sure you can turn that into content that people can digest is really important, and everyone can do it. I think more than anything, it's just making sure people within the firm have the time and they have the flexibility to make that happen, because trawling through loads of recorded calls, getting involved in those meetings, writing it all up and turning it into content is no small job. And certainly if you have the kind of people within your workforce who can do that, that's fantastic. But sometimes you need a couple of dedicated copywriters. You need some people that are good at doing things like this, like putting podcasts together or hosting webinars, to turn all of that into reality. So.
Yeah, and the same skill set that allows you to be really good at being a solicitor or any of these skills might not be the same one, and it's trying to find the people who are well suited to it. So let's say you manage to book a potential lead onto one of your webinars, or you get them through that funnel, and suddenly they've received that piece of information as a giveaway. They've saved time, they've saved money. The lawyer's not bogged down. What's the next step for you? How do you? Is there a process that's worked really well for you from turning webinar leads into a paying customer, or at least for an introductory piece of work?
I won't fib. It's not overly complex, and it's the same for many webinars that you'll have attended yourself. Just after the event, just follow up. More than anything else, just say, by the way, I hope you really enjoyed it. If you have any more questions that you weren't able to get answered during the session, please do reach out to us. If there's something more complicated you'd like to talk through, or if there's anything else worrying you, just get in touch directly. And then the lawyers that were hosting the webinar can then reach out to them and have a more involved conversation just with the one individual rather than on the call with 30 or 40 other people. And it's working well for us so far. I think it's one where, as we work our way through the process, we'll find new ways of, I guess, making that more streamlined, more efficient, I suppose, sexier to look at. But right now, more than anything, it's just making sure people have their questions answered and we follow up. So,
really good. So do you think that's a trend that we're going to see across professional services, that this trend towards, like, how can we educate people, how can we demonstrate our credibility and lure people in that way? Is that across the sector? Is that specific to these more straightforward areas of law? What do you think the future of the sector is like?
I can't really speak for my understanding, but I think it should be going that way. And for those people that don't help to, I suppose, make clients' lives easier or try and answer their questions in that sort of a way, they'll fall by the wayside, while those that do make that effort will be seen first and foremost. And again, I can only point back to, I suppose, searching for answers on the internet, because often that's what most people are doing there. If you produce content that answers those questions, you'll be seen. For those people that don't, it won't be. And very often, we find that 80% of our users start their journey at Google, whether or not they're looking at the map pack, whether they're looking at reviews, whether or not they're looking at the results that come back to them. And again, it's very much a case of answering the questions earns you a seat at the table. More than that, though, I think when you step beyond that into the realms of client service, I've been through the legal ringer a couple of times myself. And from a personal point of view, it's all too common to call a law firm, find that you have to wait, an hour for somebody to call you back. When they do call you back, they have to arrange a first point of call with you, with a lawyer, for 1 or 2 weeks' time. And you sat there thinking, I have this problem now. I need somebody to help me solve this problem right now. I can't wait for your diary. And at the same time, in a similar sort of situation, I've had lawyers say, well, until you've got £500 in an account, I can't answer that question, or I can't help you. And of course, I'm sat there thinking, well, I don't really know you. I don't know if there's that chemistry for us to work together, because we're going to be working together for a couple of years. Also, I don't know an awful lot about you as a person or your expertise either. So I don't want to pay for that until I've got a good feel for who you are. And I think very often, if you put that behind a paywall, you're immediately going to drive people away. It's like those folks that love to hide their pricing and they just don't put it anywhere. And you've got a lot of people that come to a site and go, well, it's not going to show me how much they are. They're either definitely too expensive or they're shy about it, which makes me worried, So.
I think one of the a really interesting area of of law in particular, and the one that potentially most people have contact with. I mean, nearly everyone comes into contact with lawyers in their lives, but the one they almost certainly will come into contact with at some point is conveyancing. And the process that someone goes through of going, well, I've been recommended a lawyer by my mortgage broker. I've been recommended a lawyer by the bank or by friends, and the pricing can range. There can be thousands of pounds of difference in pricing based on very little information given up front, and yet mostly a lot of the time people justifiably go to, well, this is the cheapest supplier. That's all I'm going with very little understanding about the expertise or the or whether that the skill set of that firm is suited to the kind of the process that they're going through. And I think that's going to be a really interesting one to see how that evolves, because there's so much change in the property world that can drive a real change in the market. And it's a very transactional area of law. Again, like these other simplified services, and I'd be interested to see how that will be, what they can do to evolve that, because there are all sorts of interesting areas you can find out about. I mean, certainly from a personal perspective, we went through a property transaction recently, and then later found out that if they'd advised us better, we'd be 5 figures better off on stamp duty, and so there was you just don't know these things in advance. Other than looking at the Google reviews of someone. And so it's going to be interesting to find that out. Are there any other, based on your wider experience, do you think there are other areas of law that are really behind? What would you say that is the one that's the weakest in your experience?
It's hard to say. From personal experience, I can't help but think wills and probate could do with a bit of time and attention, but I think there are many bits in there that probably bleed over into other areas as well. And I'll draw on one very specific example here, where we were offered a fixed fee to deal with a probate issue. And let me tell you now, it definitely cost triple what we were told it would. And it's funny because as a client, you see these promises like fixed fee or, instantaneous client service, these sorts of things. And very often it's rarely delivered upon. And then when you're in the meetings with the law firm internally, there's all kinds of ways to justify that. But at the end of the day, the client sat there thinking, well, no, that's not what I was promised. So in this particular example, it was one where the ownership of a particular asset hadn't been established and we hadn't been asked a question. And so much, much later down the line, when it transpired that somebody else owned it and not the person we thought it perhaps did belong to, that caused us all kinds of headache and all kinds of problems. Now, we paid for that. Even though it was an oversight of the person handling the matter, we were the ones that paid for it because, again, it comes back to those billable hours. And so it's all very well them saying, right, we'll charge you a fixed fee of this, but it's not a fixed fee at all. It's still based on the hours that they put in. And so it's a bit of a red herring. I suppose, and this is just me talking now, but when it comes to understanding how we can, I suppose, go to more of a fixed fee sort of arrangement, I think now as people get better at collecting customer information, they get better at understanding risk, there's no reason why once you've collected enough data on enough people to get an understanding of how complex those cases are, that you couldn't reasonably say, all right, if we put a fixed fee of this on this particular case, we know that some of them are going to go a bit over and we're going to have to take that charge on the chin. But for all those that we handle incredibly efficiently, like supported by technology and things like that, where we do make a bit more margin, we can get them to kind of overlap and we can then genuinely promise a fixed fee, for example. So I don't think these things are out of the realms of possibility. The challenge, however, is getting the data, getting the right kinds of data, and also collecting enough of it. Because when you're a national player, that's a bit easier to do. When you're a small local firm, on the other hand, when you're only dealing with cases in the tens rather than the hundreds or thousands, that's a much harder ask. So it's a bit of a challenge.
So do you think there's going to be a trend across the industry of moving towards more, let's call it fixed price, like value pricing models, rather than this is our billable hourly rate and our estimated number of hours?
I'd like to say that I think so, but at the same time, this has been a bone of contention in the industry for a long, long time. I mean, years ago, I was seeing articles saying the billable hour is dead, and yet, it's still here. People are still using it, So whether or not some dramatic shift comes very quickly, I'd be quite surprised if people move away from it entirely. What I believe might happen, though, for those that have the data and the capability, is they might start to build in some sort of a hybrid model, something where they can reasonably say, you know what, this is going to cost this, and this is backed up by the data that we have here. And then kind of in the interim, until they've got a really sure picture, they just test these out in sample or in isolated areas. So if you're a full service provider, you might focus on the very, very small, very compartmentalized pieces, like you were saying before, things like wills, for example. There's only so many ways that could go wrong, and then as you get better at that, is then starting to expand and get better at maybe handling some of the more complex stuff in a very similar way. So
yes, it's sort of a normal distribution, and you exclude the edge cases, but probably 80% you can come up with a set model for. Brilliant.
Yeah.
So if you were going to say if you were let's call it the head of marketing or the head of business development at a regional specialist law firm with not a vast volume of cases to work on, what would be your biggest tip for improving digitalization, improving that efficiency, and that process of turning someone who's a lead into a customer would be?
Plug everything in. Like, I was thinking about this morning, actually, and one thing that I found I've needed to do or get involved with in every single firm that I've joined very early doors is making sure that all your systems are talking to one another. So one thing that's quite common is that you'll have a client care team, for example, that are only in sort of Monday to Friday between 9 and 5. And there's, phone calls come in or email submissions come in for inquiries. What will happen is you'll lose all your MI over the weekend. So, they'll leave on a Friday, suddenly their inboxes get full of inquiries. They'll come back in the following Monday and then start to add them to your system, be it Proclaim or whatever other piece of software you're using. And suddenly you just end up with weird figures all over the place. And it diminishes your ability to understand, right, how can we better serve clients? Because in that particular example, it looks like you've got tons of inquiries coming in on a Monday. So your client care team all need to be in, hands to the pump on a Monday, when actually what you need is a skeleton team in over the Saturday and Sunday to accommodate those inquiries and actually make everyone's lives easier on the Monday. At the same time, I think with some of the advertising platforms we have available to us now, it's much, much easier to get inquiries in at scale. So working with a Liverpool-based firm a couple of years ago, they operated quite regionally, but as soon as we switched on social advertising, we were getting inquiries from all over the country, and people didn't seem to care how far away we were. And we were able to triple the size of our client base in no time at all. So it doesn't mean to say that you have to stay local. I think there's a lot of opportunity out there to scale now. So.
I guess people's interest in making inquiries about divorce doesn't necessarily work on a 9 to 5. It probably is the inverse of a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday schedule. It's probably 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning.
Well, that's it. These things, the kind of things that keep you awake at night, there's a lot of anxiety there. You're looking for answers, and sometimes it takes a while to pluck up the courage to put that inquiry in. So.
Brilliant. Well, look, it's been fantastic talking with you, and really interested to hear about everything that's going on at Stowe, but also, trends across the sector. And best of luck convincing more professional services organisations to think radically.
I'll keep trying. But thank you. It's been great being on.
Best of luck.
Thanks for joining. Remember to subscribe and follow us, and to share today's insights with other businesses who want to stay relevant in a digital-first world.